Imagine being born into a world where your worth is counted in grain, silver, or labor. Your childhood stolen, your body owned by strangers, your voice silenced by law. Families sell daughters as if they were objects. Masters claim them without consequence, and even their children are born into chains. Every step, every breath, every moment becomes a reminder. You are property, not a person. Beauty, obedience, and survival are measured in pain and submission. For millions of women in ancient China, life was a nightmare dressed as normalcy, a silent horror that generations accepted without question. Imagine a society where selling your daughter for grain wasn't a scandal. It was a regulated transaction. In ancient China, the buying and selling of women was not an occasional tragedy but an accepted part of daily life. Families under pressure, rulers writing laws, and scholars offering justifications all helped create a world where female slavery was woven into the fabric of society. What makes this reality more disturbing is not just the cruelty itself but how ordinary it became. The survival of families, the wealth of elites, and the authority of emperors were all tied to a system that stripped women of identity and reduced them to property. From the poorest villages to the highest courts, the enslavement of daughters was treated as practical economics rather than moral disaster. This was not a hidden crime but a structured and normalized practice. But the first horror wasn't hidden in palaces. It began at home when famine struck. The younger the girl, the quicker the sale, sometimes as young as 3 years old. In times of famine or financial crisis, families in ancient China were often forced to make brutal choices. Before selling land, livestock, or even treasured heirlooms, parents almost always sold their daughters first. This was not only because girls were considered less important under Confucian values, but also because there was always demand for them in the slave markets. Buyers preferred children between 7 and 12 years old. At this age, they were young enough to be shaped and controlled, yet old enough to work immediately in households or fields. For many families, selling a daughter brought enough silver to keep their sons alive through winter, or even pay for a boy's education. Some families, realizing how profitable the transaction could be, sold girls even when starvation wasn't imminent. A daughter became a form of emergency currency. Her body and future exchanged for grain or tools. The cruelty lay not only in the sale itself but in how routine it became, repeated in village after village. Yet the markets weren't chaotic. They were run with chilling efficiency by the state. In some cities, buyers could return a girl within 3 days, just like defective goods. Slave markets in ancient China were not back-alley operations but official spaces that operated under state oversight. Large cities often held trade sessions twice a week where dozens or even hundreds of girls were displayed for purchase. Government officials supervised these markets, collected transaction taxes, and kept detailed records of each sale. Rules governing the trade looked disturbingly similar to those applied to livestock. For example, if a child was found to have an illness or disability after purchase, she could be returned to the seller within a short period, just as if someone had bought a sick mule. This bureaucratic structure gave the markets an appearance of order and legitimacy, making the buying and selling of human lives seem like a normal part of urban commerce. Behind the paperwork and taxation was a cold reality. Daughters had become products with regulated value. Parents, dealers, and buyers all operated within a system that stripped away the last traces of humanity. But how did law codes justify treating human beings this way? Damaging an ox could bring harsher punishment than killing a slave girl. Under the Tang legal code, slaves were placed in the category of jianmen, literally meaning base people. This was not simply an insult but a legal designation that stripped them of the protections given to free citizens. Crimes committed against slaves carried lighter penalties than the same acts against members of the free population. In some cases, killing a female slave resulted in only a short prison term, while injuring valuable livestock could lead to harsher consequences. By embedding this hierarchy into law, the state made clear that enslaved women were not recognized as full human beings but as disposable property. These rules normalized abuse by ensuring that slave owners faced little to no risk for cruelty or even murder. The law did not merely reflect social prejudice. It actively reinforced it by declaring inferiority as a legal fact. And law wasn't just about punishment, it controlled every aspect of their lives. Even a slave's own child was legally not hers. Female slaves in ancient China had almost no personal rights. They could not own property, make contracts, or marry freely, and they had no legal standing in court. Any children they bore automatically became the property of their master, reinforcing the complete control owners had over every aspect of a woman's life. Names, which signify identity, were often stripped away. Many female slaves were referred to simply as girl or by numbers, erasing their individuality. Families were fragile or non-existent, as mothers could be separated from children at any moment, and siblings or parents could be sold to different households without warning. Even the most intimate bonds were powerless under this system. These rules were not accidental. They were designed to make women entirely dependent on their masters. And when law ended, another system took over, the bedroom. For female slaves, the law drew a cruel line. The sexual abuse of free women was a punishable crime, while the sexual use of slaves was considered part of the master's property rights. Masters could take their slaves to bed or even lend them to others without any fear of legal consequences. The distinction was simple yet horrifying. What counted as rape for one woman was routine usage for another, completely normalized by both law and custom. Young girls, often sold during famines, were trained not only for labor but also for sexual purposes, making them doubly exploited. These women could never refuse advances, and resistance carried punishment or further abuse. The system created a perverse hierarchy where the master's desires always came first, and the slave's body had no protections whatsoever. Concubinage, often framed by society as a mark of status or an elevation for select slaves, masked a deeper form of entrapment. It increased the master's control over every aspect of a woman's life, tying her labor, sexuality, and even children to his will. And while concubinage seemed like privilege, it was, in reality, a tighter cage. Becoming a concubine did not bring freedom. It replaced one form of control with another. A female slave elevated to concubinage could no longer be sold to someone else, but she was permanently bound to her master, losing any remaining autonomy. Within the household, concubines were often forced to compete for attention, status, and favor. Survival meant constant rivalry. Women learned quickly that pleasing their abuser could spare harsher treatment or secure small privileges, while failure brought punishment or neglect. This competition created a tense and hostile environment where trust between women was nearly impossible, and every interaction carried stakes for safety and survival. Even apparent privileges, such as better living conditions or special treatment, were merely tools to deepen control. And the cycle of abuse extended further. The children born to these concubines were immediately property of the master, inheriting the same lack of rights and vulnerability as their mothers. Before a child could even walk, their life was already mapped into servitude, continuing the chain of exploitation. For female slaves, pregnancy was rarely a personal choice. It was a tool of the household. Any child born to a slave mother automatically became the property of her master, ensuring that slavery persisted across generations. Some masters even deliberately arranged unions between female and male slaves to produce more children, treating reproductive capacity as a form of economic expansion. Mothers had no legal say over their bodies or the futures of their children. Their wombs were seen as sources of wealth rather than parts of a human life. Manuals and guides of the period often included advice on increasing fertility, strengthening women's bodies for labor and reproduction, or managing large slave households, treating these abuses as standard, even scientific practice. Medicine sometimes focused more on maintaining a woman's ability to bear children than on her overall health. In this way, slavery became self-perpetuating, embedding itself into family lines. The women's suffering was normalized, and even learning or surviving offered no escape. And yet, the exploitation extended further, entwining with cultural and religious practices to legitimize abuse. Ancient household manuals often included detailed instructions on managing young female slaves, from daily chores to obedience training. Girls were taught to serve silently, to accept pain without complaint, and even to endure sexual exploitation as part of their duties. Medical texts from the time reveal a similarly disturbing focus. Treatments existed not to prevent harm but to repair injuries so that slaves could continue working. Broken bones, burns, or wounds from overwork were tended like repairs on tools, emphasizing preservation over care. Doctors were not healers in the modern sense. They were enablers, maintaining the value of human property. This systematic control extended even to physical appearance. Foot binding, for example, was often enforced on female slaves to limit mobility, enhance sexual desirability, and ensure subservience. Every aspect of a woman's body, from her strength to her stature, was manipulated to benefit her master. Her identity, autonomy, and health were subordinated to the household's economic and social goals. Yet even this physical domination was only one part of the cycle of cruelty, as cultural expectations reinforced it. From a young age, female slaves were subjected to foot binding, a practice designed to permanently deform their feet. The process was excruciating. Toes were bent under the sole and tightly bound, often causing infections, gangrene, or lifelong pain. This mutilation made walking difficult, effectively preventing escape and reinforcing their dependency on masters. Foot binding was presented as a marker of beauty, turning suffering into a tool for control, while embedding social approval into the abuse. A bound foot signaled obedience, status, and a woman's value within the household, yet it came at the cost of freedom, health, and dignity. Masters could flaunt their control through the compliance of women forced into this painful tradition. Even daily tasks became torture, yet resistance was almost impossible. Breaking social norms or disobeying could lead to further punishment. Foot binding illustrates how deeply cultural ideals were weaponized against female slaves, making their oppression appear normal or even desirable. And while their bodies were constrained, the horrors of ownership extended beyond life itself, ensuring that their suffering and lack of autonomy would continue even after death. In certain periods of Ming China, it was common for concubines or female slaves to be buried alongside their deceased masters. This practice, sometimes framed as volunteering, promised rewards to the family or elevated the woman's posthumous reputation, while refusal could bring shame or suspicion. Families were often coerced into offering daughters, and the women themselves had little real choice. The act of dying with a master was glorified in records as the ultimate display of loyalty and virtue, turning a horrifying act into a supposed moral achievement. Women were praised for submission, even when the cost was their life, showing how deeply society normalized violence against them. Rituals, state expectations, and cultural narratives combined to erase autonomy, celebrating obedience as honor. The system treated women as extensions of male authority, where survival could be socially condemned and death could be lauded. Through burial practices, the state and culture reinforced the notion that female slaves existed only to serve, obey, and even die for their masters. This final cruelty underscores a broader truth. The oppression of female slaves was not accidental. It was a reflection of the society that created and perpetuated it. For centuries, millions of women in ancient China were not regarded as people. They were property. Their lives were shaped by systems that commodified daughters during famine, stripped them of rights, subjected them to sexual ownership, and forced them into concubinage or generational slavery. Cultural practices like foot binding and manuals teaching abuse reinforced obedience, while death rituals glorified their ultimate submission. The legal system, market structures, and social norms all worked together to normalize cruelty, making oppression seem ordinary. Families sold daughters as if trading goods, masters used them as instruments of labor or pleasure, and society applauded obedience even unto death. Remembering these horrors is not just about acknowledging suffering, it is about understanding how law, culture, and economy can intertwine to dehumanize entire populations. By reflecting on these practices, we see the urgent need to question systems that allow cruelty to be normalized and to honor those whose lives were treated as expendable commodities, ensuring their stories are no longer silent.